With only hours before his execution, a man sat in a cold, dimly lit cell, his hands bound in heavy chains that clinked each time he shifted in the hard wooden chair. Guards stood silently at the door, their faces unreadable, their eyes fixed anywhere but on him. And then, in that heavy silence, a sound echoed through the hall that no one expected. The faint rhythm of paws against concrete, growing louder with each second. The prisoner didn't lift his head right away, but when he did, his eyes glistened, not with fear, not with regret, but with something deeper, something raw. He hadn't asked for his favorite meal, he hadn't pleaded for mercy, and he hadn't demanded to see family. His final request, the one that shocked both guards and warden alike, was simple. He wanted to see his dog, and in that moment, as the echo of paws filled the prison walls, the room froze. No one breathed, no one moved. What happened next left even the toughest men shaken to their core and revealed a truth that would never be forgotten. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Daniel Carter was no stranger to silence. For the past 8 years, he had lived behind thick concrete walls in a high-security prison set on the edge of a quiet rural town, a place where winter seemed to stretch endlessly, and even the summers felt gray. The corridors smelled of iron and bleach, and the clang of closing cell doors was the only rhythm that marked time. Daniel was 42 years old, his face weathered beyond his years, and yet his eyes carried a kind of haunted depth, the kind that comes when a man has lived too long with regrets. For the guards, he was just another death row inmate, a number waiting for the end. But for those who had known him before, the question lingered. How did he end up here? And why? When given the choice of any last request, would he ask to see a dog? Daniel's crime was the subject of whispers in town, the kind of story people couldn't agree on. Some painted him as dangerous. Others swore he was a man who'd made one terrible mistake. But what no one could deny was the one detail that seemed out of place. The dog named Max. Max had been Daniel's loyal companion long before prison walls separated them, and somehow, even after years apart, he was the one thing Daniel wanted in his final hours. The warden himself couldn't understand it. Why not ask for family? Why not a final comfort? Why a dog? To the officers it was strange, even unsettling. But Daniel's story wasn't as simple as it seemed, and neither was his bond with Max, the dog who had been there through moments no one else ever saw. Before Daniel Carter was ever a prisoner, he was just another face in a small American town. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't powerful, and most days he wasn't even noticed. He worked odd jobs, hauling lumber at a construction site one week, fixing fences on a neighbor's property the next. Money was always short, but Daniel got by. What made the difference, what kept him from feeling entirely alone, was Max. Max was no purebred, just a scrappy mutt with floppy ears and a bark that seemed too big for his body, but Max was constant. Rain or shine, good days or bad, Daniel would return home to find Max waiting on the porch, tail wagging as if nothing else in the world mattered. Together, they formed a bond that didn't need words, a bond built on loyalty, silence, and presence, the kind of companionship only those who have truly been lonely can understand. Daniel's life had never been easy. His father had left when he was a child, and his mother, though loving, struggled to keep food on the table. By the time he was a teenager, Daniel had learned to fight for himself, often falling into the company of men who made poor choices. But even then, Max was his anchor. Long walks on dusty country roads, quiet evenings sitting on the back step with the dog at his side. It was those small, ordinary moments that gave Daniel a reason to keep trying. Yet all it took was one night to turn his life upside down, one decision that would forever change how the world saw him. The night in question was one the town still whispered about. A robbery had gone wrong at a small corner store just a few miles from Daniel's trailer. A man was shot and killed in the chaos. Police reports placed Daniel near the scene, and within hours, his name was tied to the crime. The trial was swift, the evidence thin but convincing enough for a jury, and Daniel Carter was sentenced to death for a life he swore he hadn't taken. To some, it seemed like justice served. To others, it was a tragedy of circumstance. A man in the wrong place at the wrong time, paying the ultimate price. And through it all, Max disappeared from the public eye. Neighbors claimed he'd been taken in by a kind woman down the road. Others said the dog had wandered off, waiting for a master who never returned. But for Daniel, the silence about Max cut deeper than the sentence itself. The one soul who had never abandoned him was gone, and he faced the years ahead with nothing but memories. Yet what no one could have expected was that years later, evidence would suggest a different story. That perhaps Daniel Carter was not the monster painted by headlines, and that maybe, just maybe, the truth had been buried beneath fear, assumptions, and a desperate rush for justice. When word first spread through the prison walls that Daniel Carter had requested to see his dog, confusion rippled through the staff. Requests for steak dinners, a final cigarette, or a phone call were common. But this was different. Guards exchanged uneasy glances, their boots echoing on the linoleum floors as they spoke in hushed tones. Was it even possible? Was it safe to bring a dog inside death row? In a place where rules were ironclad and security was everything, the idea of bending tradition for a condemned man unsettled more than a few. Some officers argued it was a risk. What if the animal caused chaos? What if it triggered Daniel in ways no one could control? After all, he was a man convicted of taking a life. Could anyone really trust him with this moment? Yet there were others who saw it differently. For the chaplain, it was a chance to show compassion in the face of death, a reminder that even the condemned were still human. For a few guards, men hardened by years of watching inmates march toward the end, there was something disarming in the thought. Perhaps allowing Daniel to see Max wasn't about him at all, but about the dignity of a final goodbye, about giving even a prisoner one last glimpse of love before the curtain fell. The debate stretched late into the night, words echoing through sterile hallways, where the smell of disinfectant clung to the air and the ticking of the old wall clock seemed louder than ever. Each second brought Daniel closer to his execution, yet still no decision was made. Meanwhile, Daniel sat quietly in his cell, his voice calm but broken when the warden finally asked him to explain. Why the dog? Why not food or family or freedom in prayer? Daniel's answer was simple, almost too quiet to catch. He never judged me, he said. He was the only one who stayed. His words hung heavy in the air, striking even the most seasoned officer with a truth they couldn't ignore. In that moment, Daniel was no longer just a number on death row, no longer just a case file or a headline. He was a man, stripped of everything, clinging to the last piece of love he believed he had left. The clock ticked past midnight, the halls eerily silent, when the warden stood at the center of the debate. The guards watched, waiting for his word. A man whose decisions had sealed countless fates before now faced a choice that seemed small on paper, but carried the weight of everything that was about to unfold. And then, after a long pause that felt like eternity, the warden made a decision that would change everything. As the decision was made and preparations quietly began to honor Daniel's last request, his story took shape in fragments, pieces of a life that few had ever truly understood. Daniel's childhood had been marked not by joy, but by survival. His earliest memories were not of toys or birthdays, but of slammed doors, raised voices, and nights when the house was too quiet because his father was gone again. By the time he was 10, Daniel had learned to hide bruises beneath long sleeves, to tell teachers he had fallen, to smile when he was expected to smile. He grew up fast, too fast, and the world rarely showed him kindness. It was no wonder, then, that when life dealt its harshest blows, he clung to the one constant that had never hurt him: Max. Years later, when Daniel found himself without a roof, sleeping on park benches and scraping together change for food. It was Max who stood guard through the long nights. The dog would curl beside him when frost blanketed the ground, baring his teeth at strangers who came too close. In those years, Daniel was invisible to most, another drifter wandering the edge of town. But to Max, he was everything. That kind of loyalty carved its way into Daniel's soul. He often said later that Max had saved him more times than he could count, though he never explained how. Perhaps it was from danger, perhaps it was from himself. But woven into Daniel's story was a darker thread, one that raised questions no one seemed eager to answer. The robbery that had taken a man's life wasn't just random, and whispers suggested Daniel had known at least one of the people involved. A childhood friend turned criminal, a desperate man Daniel had tried to distance himself from, yet whose shadow lingered over that night. The case files told one story, but in the corners of town, another was whispered. That maybe Daniel hadn't pulled the trigger at all, but had been caught in a storm of choices not entirely his own. And then came the twist that began to unravel everything. Years after Daniel's conviction, a box of evidence was discovered buried in the archives. Blood samples, fingerprints, reports that had never been properly tested. Some of it had been mishandled, mislabeled, and quietly forgotten. Experts would later argue that what had been presented in court was incomplete, even misleading. And if that was true, then the question everyone had avoided suddenly became unavoidable. What if Daniel Carter had been condemned for a crime he did not commit? The thought haunted those who knew his story, and it deepened the silence inside the prison walls. For if Daniel wasn't the real killer, then who was? The decision had been made, and the halls of the prison seemed heavier that morning as the plan was quietly set in motion. Guards walked with measured steps, their radios silent, their faces drawn in an unusual stillness. Few of them had ever seen something like this before, and fewer still believed they ever would again. From the far end of the corridor came the sound of claws clicking against the polished floor. It was faint at first, almost like a memory slipping into the present, and then it grew louder. Each echo carried weight. Each step reminded the men watching that this was no ordinary request. This was the final wish of a man about to meet his end. When the gate opened, Max hesitated only for a moment before pulling forward, nose pressed to the ground, tail moving with restless energy. The years apart seemed to vanish the instant his eyes found Daniel. The prisoner, once steady and restrained, collapsed to his knees. Chains rattled against the floor, but no one moved to stop him. Daniel's shoulders trembled, his hands outstretched, and in a blur of fur and sound, Max lunged into his arms. The silence shattered. Daniel pressed his face into the dog's neck, and the kind of sound that left his mouth was not the cry of a guilty man, nor the shout of anger, but the broken release of someone carrying years of weight too heavy for words. The guards stood frozen. Some swallowed hard, unable to mask the sting in their eyes. One officer turned away, gripping the bars so tightly his knuckles turned white. Another, a man who had spent decades on death row detail, lowered his head as a tear slipped down his cheek. These were men who had seen everything: anger, denial, defiance, but never this. Never a moment so stripped of pride, so filled with raw human grief and love. And in that single space of time, the walls of death row seemed to vanish. For a moment, there was no prison, no sentence, no countdown to the end. There was only a man and his dog, and the bond no prison walls could break. The warden, watching from behind the glass, found his chest heavy with something he hadn't felt in years. Regret, perhaps, or the aching recognition of what had been lost to mistakes that could never be undone. The chaplain whispered a prayer under his breath, though even he seemed unsure who it was for, the condemned or those left to witness. Everyone in that room knew this was supposed to be the end, the final chapter in a life already decided. But just when they thought this was the end, something happened that no one expected. For a while the room was filled with nothing but the quiet sound of Daniel's sobs and the soft whine of Max pressed against him. But then something changed. Max's body stiffened, his ears pricked forward, and in an instant, the loyal dog broke free from Daniel's arms. His bark ripped through the silence, sharp and unrelenting, aimed not at Daniel nor the warden, but at one of the guards standing along the wall. The sound startled everyone. Officers shifted uneasily, hands instinctively resting on their belts, but Max didn't back down. His hackles rose, and he barked with a fury that seemed to carry years of recognition. The guard in question, a man named Officer Grant, shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the stares suddenly fixed on him. He muttered something about dogs being unpredictable, yet his eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. To most in the room, it was nothing more than a strange moment. But to Daniel, it was as if puzzle pieces long buried began to move into place. Max had seen this man before, not here, not in the prison, but years earlier, on the night everything had gone wrong. Whispers spread quickly in the days that followed. Old records were revisited, small details pulled from dusty files. It was then that cracks in the story began to appear. Officer Grant had once been part of the initial response team at the corner store where the robbery had taken place. His name appeared briefly in early reports, but was later buried under paperwork. Rumors tied him to one of the suspects who had fled that night, a connection conveniently overlooked when the case against Daniel was built. And as new eyes studied the files, the truth grew harder to ignore. Evidence had been mishandled, testimonies overlooked, and some fingerprints never matched. What once seemed like justice now looked eerily like corruption. The flashbacks told a story no one wanted to believe. A rushed investigation, a community desperate for answers, and a scapegoat too poor to fight the system. Daniel Carter had become the easy choice, the name that silenced questions and closed the case. But Max's reaction reopened it all in seconds. Could the dog's instinct have unearthed a truth buried for nearly a decade? Was the man standing in uniform among them connected to the very crime that had condemned Daniel to die? The room fell into an uneasy silence. Daniel's hands trembled as he looked at the guard, not with hatred, but with the hollow weight of someone realizing his life might have been stolen by forces beyond his control. The warden, shaken and pale, struggled to reconcile what he was seeing. Everyone present could feel it, the foundation of certainty cracking beneath their feet. And yet the question loomed heavier than ever. If Daniel Carter wasn't the real killer, then who was? And with only hours left on the clock, could the truth come out in time? The hours that followed were a storm of unease. Lawyers were called in hastily, their voices sharp with urgency as papers rustled and phones rang down quiet prison corridors. The warden, a man who had built his entire career on procedure and order, found himself at the center of a moral crossroads. For the first time in years, his hands trembled as he held the case file that had condemned Daniel Carter. How much of it could he still trust? How much of it was already unraveling? Inside the prison walls, staff whispered in corners. Some argued that nothing could be done, that the execution date had been set, and to question it now would mean questioning the entire system. Others, their eyes still wet from the reunion they had just witnessed, spoke with a different conviction. They wondered aloud whether justice was truly being served, or if they were about to witness the final act of a mistake too big to undo. The chaplain pressed his palms together, urging compassion, while a senior guard who had once spoken of Daniel with contempt now admitted softly, "He doesn't look like a killer. Not anymore. Maybe he never was." For Daniel there was no celebration, no sense of victory in the chaos. He sat quietly with Max still at his side, eyes fixed on the floor, as if even hope was too heavy to hold. And yet, the sight of him there, broken, human, clinging to the one creature that had never left him, changed something in the hearts of those around him. Even men who had once sworn they would never feel pity for the condemned now found themselves unsettled, unsure, caught between the weight of the law and the whisper of their conscience. And so the debate reached its peak. Should they halt the execution to review evidence that might save an innocent man? Or was the machine of justice too powerful, too far gone to stop? The warden stared at the clock, the second hand ticking closer to the scheduled hour, each sound like a hammer on his chest. And now the question is no longer theirs alone. It belongs to us all. If you were the warden, standing in his shoes, what would you do? Would you let justice take its course? Or would you stop everything? The clock ticked down to the final minutes, the air in the prison thick with silence. Outside, the night was still, but inside, every breath felt heavy, every glance carried the weight of history about to be written. Two paths stretched ahead, each carrying its own mark on the lives of everyone who stood witness. In one telling, the tragic ending unfolded. Despite the doubts, despite the whispers of injustice, the system moved forward like a machine that could not be stopped. Daniel Carter was led to his final moments, Max's whines echoing down the corridor as guards held him back. And when it was over, a quiet rage swept across the nation. Newspapers questioned the trial, lawyers demanded reforms, and Daniel's name became the rallying cry for change. Yet through the grief, Max remained, living out his days with those who cared for him, his loyalty undimmed. To many, he became more than just a dog. He became a symbol of what unconditional love looks like in a world too often blinded by judgment. But in another telling, the story shifted. Just as Daniel was being prepared for the end, a call cut through the silence. The warden's hand froze, the order halted. New evidence, undeniable and urgent, had surfaced at the last possible moment. The fingerprints, the records, the testimony once buried now told a different story. Daniel Carter had been innocent all along. Shockwaves ripped through the prison as Daniel was pulled back from the brink of death. And there, in the same room where he had held Max as a condemned man, he held him again as a free one. For Daniel, the years lost could never be returned, but the chance to walk out of those gates with Max at his side was more than he had dared to hope for. It was the beginning of a life reclaimed. Whichever ending you choose to believe, one truth remains unchanged. This was never just a story about crime and punishment. It was about loyalty that never faltered, truth that refused to stay buried, and a love that outlasted even death itself. What do you think? Should Daniel have been granted his last wish? And do you believe justice was truly served, or was this a story of a man lost to a broken system? Share your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear how this story made you feel, and what you believe should have been done in those final hours. Your perspective matters, because stories like this are not just about the people who lived them, but about the questions they leave behind for all of us. If this story moved you the way it moved us, please take a moment to hit the like button. It helps us bring more of these powerful stories to people around the world. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the gripping stories we share here every week.